Let me tell you about a Saturday evening in October of 1983 in the Bitterroot Valley of western Montana, when a 72-year-old widower in a gray flannel sport coat with frayed cuffs walked up the limestone steps of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club and was told, very politely and very firmly, that he would not be seated for dinner. His name was Hollis Granger. Most everyone in Ravalli County called him Hall, and the ones who'd known him longest, the ones who remembered him standing up at the front of the little Lutheran church in Hamilton on a Friday evening in October of 1937, with a quiet, brown-haired girl named Marion Voss on his arm. Those people called him Hole Granger, and meant something specific by it. They meant a man who had married into one of the oldest ranching families in the valley, and never once in 46 years of marriage acted like the land or the name was his by anything other than the grace of the woman he had loved. Marion had died in the spring of 1981, a stroke at 66, on a Tuesday morning in March, in the kitchen of the ranch house on Granger Lane, south of Hamilton, with a half-finished cup of coffee on the table beside her, and the Missoulian spread open to the obituary page she'd been reading. Hollis had been out at the barn with Wendell Pomeroy, his foreman of 38 years, looking at a heifer that had come in early. He had not been with her at the end. He carried that as a man carries a stone in his coat pocket, not heavily, not visibly, but always. Saturday, October 8th, 1983, was their anniversary. 46 years since the Lutheran church and the small reception in the basement and the drive up the valley to the Voss family ranch where her father had set out a single bottle of Canadian whiskey and a single round of toasts. Every year for 43 years, Marion had insisted on attending the Bitterroot Valley Country Club's annual harvest dinner on the second Saturday in October, because the harvest dinner fell closest to their anniversary, and because the club had hosted her parents' wedding reception in 1908, and because the back dining room with the river bend windows had been where her grandfather, Theodore Voss, had been honored on his 85th birthday in 1937, 3 weeks before she walked down the church aisle on his arm. The harvest dinner was for her, a tether to people who were gone. For 2 years after Marion died, Hollis had not gone. He could not stomach the thought of the room without her. But this year, the 3rd year of widowhood, he had decided to go alone. He owed her at least that. He owed her the table by the river bend window, the chicken pot pie with the lattice crust that the kitchen had served since the Depression, the long autumn light on the white tablecloths, the brass bell above the kitchen pass that the staff had been ringing for orders since 1923. He dressed for it carefully. He took down from the cedar wardrobe in the upstairs hall the gray flannel sport coat that had belonged to his father, Carl Granger, since 1949, and that he himself had worn for the last 26 years to every wedding, every funeral, every harvest dinner. The cuffs were frayed in 2 places. The right elbow had been mended once by Marion in the autumn of 1976. A careful, invisible patch of matching gray wool she had picked up at a tailor's in Missoula. The lining at the left armhole was beginning to give. He owned no other sport coat. He had never seen the need. He put on a white cotton shirt that Marion had ironed for him in February of 1981, 3 weeks before she died, and that he had kept folded in tissue paper in the bottom drawer of his bureau ever since for occasions like this one. He put on a black wool tie. He put on the cracked leather belt he had bought at Pomeroy's Saddlery in Hamilton in 1962. He put on his good gray slacks and his black dress shoes, which were the only dress shoes he owned, and were nearly as old as the coat. At 5:45 in the evening, he walked out to the green Ford F-250 in the gravel turnaround, climbed in, and drove the 12 miles north to the country club entrance off the East Side Highway south of Hamilton. The club sat on 320 acres at the southern bend of the Bitterroot River, where the river curved hard east around a low rise of cottonwoods and willows. The clubhouse was a long two-story building of native limestone and milled fir, with a wide veranda facing the water and a porte cochere on the roadside where members and their guests pulled up to be greeted. Theodore Voss, Marion's grandfather, had leased that 320 acres to the founding members of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club in the summer of 1923, on a ground lease of 60 years, at a rent of $1 per year, payable on the 1st of October. He had done it because his oldest daughter, Marion's aunt, Adeline, had married into the Cordell family of Hamilton timber money, and the Cordells had wanted a clubhouse on the river. And Theodore had been a man who did favors for his daughters, even when his sons advised against it. The lease had been drawn by Augustus Holloway, of Holloway and Sons, attorneys in Missoula, on August the 14th, 1923. And recorded at the Raleigh County Courthouse on August the 17th. It would expire on October the 14th, 1983, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 60 years to the hour after Theodore had signed it at the River Bend meadow with a fountain pen Augustus had loaned him. Hollis Granger knew all of that. He had inherited the trusteeship of the Voss family land trust 8 months earlier, in February of 1983, when Marion's older brother, Roland Voss, had died of heart failure in his sleep at the old Voss home place on the upper end of the valley. Roland had been the prior trustee. Roland had been a friendly old man, full of stories about the club, full of assumptions that the lease would be renewed at expiry, just as a matter of course, full of plans to walk into a room of board members with a handshake and a yes. Roland had told the club president as much at the Christmas party in 1982, 8 weeks before he died. The club had taken him at his word. The club had not, in the 8 months since, bothered to learn that the trusteeship had passed to a different man. Hollis pulled the green Ford into the porte cochere at 6 minutes past 6 and handed the keys to the young valet, a Hamilton High School boy named Kobe Reams, whose grandfather had cowboyed on the Voss Ranch in the 1930s. Kobe touched the brim of his cap and said, "Evening, Mr. Granger." And Hollis nodded back at him and walked up the limestone steps in his father's old coat. The double doors of the clubhouse opened onto a wide foyer with a stone fireplace at the far end and a roll-top hostess podium just inside on the right. Behind the podium, in a black pinstripe blazer with his hair slicked back tight against his skull, stood a young man Hollis had never seen before in his life. The brass nameplate on the podium read, "Trent Pickering, General Manager." Pickering had been brought to the Bitterroot Valley Country Club in May of 1983 by a vote of 7 board members to 4, on the recommendation of a Denver club management consortium called Summit Hospitality Partners. He was 31 years old, held a degree in hotel administration from a college in Arizona, and had been hired specifically to modernize the club. Modernize meant several things. It meant a new wine list. It meant a more aggressive policy on dues collection. It meant a refreshed dress code, posted in the foyer in a glass-fronted brass frame, that required gentlemen at the dinner hour to wear a sport coat or blazer in good condition, along with collared shirt, dress slacks, and dress shoes. The phrase, "in good condition," had been Pickering's addition. He had told the membership committee in June that he intended to use it. Hollis Granger crossed the foyer in his father's gray sport coat, with the frayed cuffs and the mended elbow, and stopped at the podium. Pickering looked up, looked him over, looked at the cuffs, looked at the cracked belt, looked at the worn shoes, looked at the white cotton shirt that had not been ironed since February of 1981, and at the black wool tie that had been knotted approximately 500 times in approximately 26 years and was beginning to shine at the knot. "Good evening, sir," Pickering said. "Evening," Hollis said. "Granger, reservation for one." Pickering looked down at the leather reservation book, made a small show of running his finger down the page, and then looked back up. "I see your name here, Mr. Granger. I'm afraid, however, that the club's dress code at the dinner hour requires a sport coat in good condition. I'm sure you understand." Hollis stood very still. He could feel the room behind Pickering, the sound of crystal and silver from the dining hall, the low autumn light through the river bend windows that he could just see past Pickering's shoulder. He could feel Marion's table. "This coat was my father's," he said. "I'm sure," Pickering said. "It's a fine coat, sir. The condition, however." "I've worn it to this dinner every year for 26 years. "I understand, Mr. Granger. The dress code has been updated. I'm sure the board will be reaching out shortly with the new guidelines. For this evening, I'm afraid I can't seat you. May I have one of our staff phone you a cab home, or arrange any other—" "No," Hollis said. He stood for one more moment. He looked past Pickering, past the leather podium, past the foyer, into the dining room. At the far end of the dining room, near the river bend window, he could see the table that had been Marion's. There was no place set at it. The club had not bothered to set it. Hollis Granger nodded once, slowly, to no one in particular. He turned around. He walked back across the foyer, out the double doors, down the limestone steps, and across the porte-cochere to Kobe Reams, who was still holding the keys. "Going home, Mr. Granger," Kobe said. "Going home, son." Kobe handed him the keys. He climbed into the green Ford. He drove the 12 miles south, down the East Side Highway, and the 3 miles west on Granger Lane to the ranch house, in the long October dark, with the cottonwoods bare and the river running low and the headlights of the truck sweeping the empty road. He did not weep. He did not curse. He did not say a word out loud the whole way home. He pulled into the gravel turnaround at 20 minutes past 7. He went into the kitchen. He took off his father's coat and hung it on the peg by the back door. He took down a cup from the shelf where Marion had kept the cups, and he poured himself a cup of the coffee that Wendell Pomeroy's wife, Idella, always left on the warming plate when she came in to clean on Saturdays. He sat at the kitchen table where Marion had died, in the chair that had been her chair, and he drank the coffee. And he looked out the kitchen window at the dark fence line of the south pasture, where 4 generations of Voss and Granger cattle had grazed. When he had finished the coffee, he went into the front room, opened the roll-top desk that had belonged to Theodore Voss, and pulled out the long, oak file drawer at the bottom. Inside the file drawer, in a manila folder, labeled in Marion's hand, VFLT, Ground Leases, 1922 to 1990, was the original copy of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club ground lease. He carried it back to the kitchen. He sat down at the table. He turned on the overhead light. He read. He read all 60 years of it. He read paragraph 1, in which the Voss Family Trust granted to the founding members of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club, their successors and assigns, the use of 320 acres at the southern bend of the Bitterroot River, more particularly described in Schedule A, for the purpose of a clubhouse and grounds. He read paragraph 3, in which the lease term was fixed at 60 years, commencing October the 14th, 1923, and expiring October the 14th, 1983, at the hour of 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He read paragraph 6, in which the rent was fixed at $1 per year, payable on or before the 1st of October each year, without escalation. He read paragraph 8, in which any continued occupation of the premises by the lessee or its successors past the hour of expiration was deemed to constitute trespass, and the lessor was granted the immediate right of re-entry and possession without further notice. He read paragraph 9, in which all improvements made by the lessee upon the premises during the term, including but not limited to the clubhouse, outbuildings, fixtures, and landscape installations, would upon expiration of the lease revert to the lessor without compensation or right of removal. There was no renewal clause. There was no holdover, no renewal clause. There was no holdover tenancy. There was no option to extend. There was, in the careful old hand of Augustus Holloway, in August of 1923, the unambiguous language of a man who had been told by his client to draw a lease that would run 60 years and then end. Hollis Granger closed the folder. He sat at the kitchen table in the chair that had been Marion's. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked over to 10 minutes past 9. He picked up the phone on the wall by the icebox, and he dialed the home number of Garrett Holloway, son of Augustus, of Holloway and Sons, Missoula, who had been Roland Voss's attorney and was now his. Garrett picked up on the third ring. "Granger," Hollis said. "Hall Granger, from the valley." "Evening, Hall. I need to come up to Missoula in the morning. I need to talk about the country club ground lease." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Garrett Holloway was 64 years old. He had been admitted to the Montana bar in 1944. His father Augustus had drawn the country club lease in 1923. Sitting at the same oak desk Garrett now sat at every morning. Garrett had been waiting, in a quiet way, for this phone call for about 3 years. "What time?" 8. 8 will do." "Garrett." "Yes, Hall." "It expires Friday." "I know it does. They wouldn't seat me tonight." There was another pause. Then Garrett Holloway said, in the careful, flat voice of a small-town Montana attorney who has watched a great many things in his life, "I'll have the file pulled by 8." Hollis hung up the phone. He went to the back porch and stood for a long time looking south at the dark Bitterroot Range. He went up the stairs to the bedroom that had been his and Marion's. He laid his father's gray flannel sport coat across the foot of the bed. He went to sleep at 11:15 and slept 7 hours, and woke at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, October the 9th. By 8 on Monday morning, October the 10th, Hollis was sitting in the front office of Holloway and Sons on West Broadway in Missoula. in a brown leather chair that had been there since 1923, drinking coffee out of a heavy white china cup. Garrett Holloway sat across the desk in a gray suit. Between them was a manila folder thicker than Hollis's and containing every recorded instrument, every amendment, every notice of trustee succession, every county filing related to the Bitterroot Valley Country Club ground lease and the Voss family land trust going back to August the 14th, 1923. "Walk me through it," Hollis said. Garrett did. He walked Hollis through the chain of trusteeship. Theodore Voss, 1923 to 1941. Marion's father, Klaus Voss, 1941 to 1968. Roland Voss, 1968 to February the 15th, 1983, when Roland died. Then, by the terms of the Voss Family Land Trust, as last amended in 1974, the trusteeship passed not to any of Roland's children, but to the surviving spouse of the eldest daughter of Klaus Voss, meaning on Roland's death, to Hollis Granger, as the widower of Marion Voss Granger. The succession had been recorded at the Ravalli County Courthouse on February the 22nd, 1983. A copy had been mailed to every entity holding a current contract with the trust, including the Bitterroot Valley Country Club, on February the 25th, by certified mail. The certified return receipt, signed in a hand Garrett did not recognize, had been received back in the Holloway and Sons office on March the 2nd. The club's records office in Hamilton somewhere had a copy. "They never read it," Hollis said. "They never read it." "What can we do?" Garrett laid 2 pages on the desk between them. The first was a draft notice of lease expiration and non-renewal addressed to the Board of Directors, Bitterroot Valley Country Club, Hamilton, Montana, and to Mr. Trent Pickering as general manager, citing paragraphs 3, 6, 8, and 9 of the August 14th, 1923 ground lease, and stating that the Voss Family Land Trust would assert its full reversionary rights at the hour of expiration on Friday, October the 14th, 1983, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The second was a draft notice of demand for delivery of all premises, fixtures, and improvements as of 5 o'clock and 1 minute on the same Friday afternoon, with all club personnel and club property to be off the premises by midnight on Saturday the 15th, or be considered trespassers subject to a sheriff's writ of ejectment. Both signed by you as trustee, both filed of record, both delivered by hand to the club's office in Hamilton this afternoon, and by certified mail to every member of the board at their home addresses. Do it, Hollis said. Garrett picked up the office phone and called for his secretary. By 11 o'clock that morning, a courier was on the East Side Highway south of Missoula, with 2 manila envelopes in the passenger seat. By 2 in the afternoon, the courier was walking up the limestone steps of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club with a clipboard. By 2:15, Trent Pickering was sitting in his office behind a closed door with the first manila envelope open on his blotter and his face the color of skim milk. By 3, Pickering had the Denver office of Summit Hospitality Partners on the line. By 4, he had the board president, Marshall Cordell, on the line. By 5, Marshall Cordell was on the phone to every other board member he could reach. And by 7 that evening, 8 men in coats and ties were sitting around the long oak table in the upstairs boardroom of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club, staring at a yellow legal pad on which Marshall Cordell had written, in block capitals across the top, 4 days. Marshall Cordell was 58 years old. He owned the Cordell Lumber Company of Hamilton, the largest private timber operation in the western half of Ravalli County. His grandfather, Albert Cordell, had been one of the 11 founding members of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club in the summer of 1923, and had stood beside Theodore Voss at the Riverbend Meadow when the lease was signed. Marshall had played his first round of golf on the club's 6-hole course at the age of 9. He had been married in the clubhouse in 1949. He had buried his father from the clubhouse in 1971. He understood, in a way Pickering did not, what the lease expiring meant. He understood also that the board was looking at him. "All right," he said, we try Granger first, tonight." He drove south down the East Side Highway in the dark and turned west on Granger Lane and pulled up to the gate of the Granger Ranch at 20 minutes to 9. The gate was closed. Wendell Pomeroy was standing inside the gate in a sheepskin coat with a flashlight in one hand. "Evening, Mr. Cordell." "Evening, Wendell. I'd like a word with Hall." "Mr. Granger isn't taking visitors this evening." "Wendell, it's important." "I'm sure it is, Mr. Cordell." Marshall Cordell stood at the closed gate for nearly 2 minutes. Wendell Pomeroy did not move. The Bitterroot wind came down through the cottonwoods. Marshall Cordell turned around, got back into his car, drove the 12 miles north to Hamilton, sat in his kitchen until well past midnight, and at 8 the next morning, Wednesday, October the 12th, was sitting in the front office of Holloway and Sons in Missoula. Garrett Holloway received him in the same brown leather chair Hollis had sat in on Monday. "I need to negotiate with Mr. Granger," Cordell said. "Mr. Granger has authorized no negotiations." "There must be terms." "At the moment, there are no terms." Cordell sat for a long time. He looked at the framed photograph on the wall behind Garrett's desk. Augustus Holloway and Theodore Voss and a third man Cordell did not know, standing at the Riverbend Meadow in 1923, the meadow grass tall around their knees, all 3 of them in dark suits, Augustus holding the rolled lease. "Garrett." "Yes, Marshall." "Will he take a new lease?" "I do not know what he will take. I can put a question to him." "Please do." Garrett Holloway put the question to Hollis Granger by telephone at 11 that morning. Hollis listened. He thought for some time. He looked out the kitchen window at the south pasture. Then he gave Garrett 4 conditions. The first condition was a new ground lease of 25 years at an annual rent of $48,000, payable on the 1st of October each year, with a renegotiation clause every 10 years. The second condition was that the language in paragraph 9 of the original lease, regarding reversion of improvements, would be carried forward verbatim into the new lease. The third condition was that Trent Pickering's employment as general manager of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club would be terminated, in writing, effective no later than the hour of 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, October the 14th, before any new lease would be signed. The fourth condition was that the club's membership and dress code policies would be amended by board action at a duly called meeting within 30 days of the new lease to remove any provision permitting the refusal of seating, service, or membership on the basis of the condition of a member's clothing as distinguished from the type of his clothing. Coats would be required. Frayed coats would not be cause for refusal. The amendment would be permanent and would survive the lease. By 2 o'clock Wednesday afternoon, Garrett had delivered the 4 conditions to Marshall Cordell at the Cordell Lumber Company offices in Hamilton. By 6 o'clock Wednesday evening, the 8 men of the board were back around the long oak table in the upstairs boardroom of the country club. By 9 o'clock Wednesday evening, they had agreed, 7-1, with one member abstaining for personal reasons that he did not need to explain, that all 4 conditions would be met. By 10 o'clock Thursday morning, October the 13th, Trent Pickering was sitting across the desk from Marshall Cordell in the upstairs boardroom receiving a letter of termination, effective 5 o'clock Friday afternoon, signed by all 7 of the consenting board members. Pickering protested. Pickering threatened. Pickering invoked Denver. Marshall Cordell, who had buried his father from the clubhouse 12 years before, did not raise his voice and did not lower it. He simply slid the letter across the desk and asked Pickering to clear his office by sundown. By 3 o'clock Friday afternoon, October the 14th, the new ground lease was drafted, reviewed, redrafted, and signed in duplicate by all 7 of the consenting board members. At 4:55 that same Friday afternoon, Hollis Granger pulled the green Ford F-250 into the porte cochere of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club in his father's gray flannel sport coat with the frayed cuffs and the mended elbow. Kobe Reams was at the porte cochere. He touched the brim of his cap and said, "Evening, Mr. Granger." "Evening, Kobe." The double doors of the foyer were open. The hostess podium on the right was empty. Trent Pickering's brass nameplate had been removed. Behind the podium, in a black skirt and a white blouse with a small gold pin at the collar, stood Edith Yarrow, the dining room hostess of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club. 71 years old, 35 years at the club, who had walked Marion Voss Granger to her table by the Riverbend window every second Saturday in October from 1948 through 1980. Edith looked up. Edith saw Hollis Granger in his father's coat. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "Welcome, Mr. Granger. Your table is ready if you'd like to come straight through." "Edith, there's a small matter in the boardroom first." "Of course, right this way." She walked him up the back stairs to the upstairs boardroom. Around the long oak table sat the 7 board members who had voted yes and the one who had abstained. Marshall Cordell stood at the head of the table with the new ground lease in front of him in 2 clean blue covers and a single black fountain pen laid across the top. Garrett Holloway, who had driven down from Missoula at 3, was standing by the window with his briefcase at his feet. "Mr. Granger, Marshall, the lease." Hollis Granger looked at the 2 blue covers. He looked at the 7 men. He looked finally at the framed photograph on the wall over the sideboard, which was the same photograph Garrett Holloway had on the wall of his office in Missoula, Augustus Holloway and Theodore Voss, and a 3rd man, standing in the Riverbend meadow in 1923. The 3rd man, Hollis had figured out at some point during the week, was Albert Cordell, Marshall's grandfather, the man who had told Theodore Voss that a clubhouse on the river would be a fine thing for the valley. "I'll sign," Hollis said. He took up the black fountain pen. He signed the first blue cover on the line marked "Lessor." He signed the second. He laid the pen down. Marshall Cordell, on behalf of the 7, signed on the line marked "Lessee." At 3 minutes past 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, October the 14th, 1983, the new ground lease of the Bitterroot Valley Country Club was executed. By the terms of paragraph 8 of the 1923 lease for the space of approximately 2.5 minutes between 5 o'clock and 3 minutes past 5. The entire 320 acres at the southern bend of the Bitterroot River, the limestone clubhouse, the river veranda, the dining room, the kitchen, the brass bell over the pass, and every fixture, table, chair, plate, cup, fork, and crystal glass in the building had belonged free and clear, with no obligation of compensation, to the Voss Family Land Trust and its sole trustee, Hollis Granger of Granger Lane, south of Hamilton. He held the deed by Friday. He folded the executed copy into the inside pocket of his father's gray flannel sport coat. He shook Marshal Cordell's hand. He nodded to the 7 and the 1. He walked back down the stairs with Edith Yarrow on his arm. She walked him through the foyer, through the dining room, past the stone fireplace and the tall windows, all the way to the back, to the table by the river bend window that had been Marion Voss Granger's table from the second Saturday in October of 1948 to the second Saturday in October of 1980. It was set for 2. Mrs. Yarrow. Mr. Granger. Who asked for 2? I did, Mr. Granger. I hope you don't mind. He stood for a moment beside the empty chair across from his own. The river ran past the window, low and slow in October light. The cottonwoods on the far bank were going yellow. He could see, if he turned his head, the brass bell above the kitchen pass. I don't mind, Mrs. Yarrow. He sat down. He ordered the chicken pot pie with the lattice crust. He ate it slowly. He drank a cup of coffee at the end. He paid the bill with cash from a small leather billfold his father had given him in 1949. He left a generous tip for Edith Yarrow. At 6:45, he walked out through the foyer in his father's gray flannel sport coat, with the frayed cuffs and the mended elbow, down the limestone steps, into the porte cochere where Kobe Reams was holding the keys. Going home, Mr. Granger? Going home, son. He drove the 12 miles south down the East Side Highway in the long Friday dark. But he did not turn at Granger Lane. He drove 3 miles further south to the small private cemetery on the rise above the original Voss home place, where Theodore and Klaus and Roland Voss were buried, and Marion beside them under a flat granite stone that read, Marion Voss Granger, beloved wife, 1915 to 1981. He stood at the stone in his father's coat. The October wind came down off the bitterroots. He laid his right hand flat against the top of the granite. Marion. He stood for a long time. They wouldn't seat me Saturday. He stood for a longer time. It's done now. The meadow's home. The lease is good for 25 years. The new boy's gone. Edith set the table for 2. He stood until the cold began to bite through the coat at the elbow. I'm coming home now. He drove the 3 miles back north and the half-mile west on Granger Lane and parked the green Ford in the gravel turnaround. The kitchen light was on. Wendell Pomeroy and Adela had heard the truck and were sitting at the kitchen table when he came in. Adela stood up. She had a pot of coffee on the stove. She poured 2 cups, then a third, then a fourth. Hollis Granger hung his father's gray flannel sport coat on the peg by the back door. He sat down in his chair at the head of the table. Wendell sat at his right. Adela sat across. The 4th cup of coffee, no spoon, no creamer, sat at the place across from Hollis, where Marion had always sat. He picked up his cup. He held it up a few inches above the wood. To my father, who bought me this coat. Wendell raised his cup. Adela raised hers. To Theodore Voss, who signed a 60-year lease and meant it to end. They raised them again. To Edith Yarrow, who set the table for two. They raised them again. To Marion. The fourth cup sat steaming on the oilcloth. They held theirs in the air a long moment. To Marion, Wendell said. To Marion, Idella said. They drank. And that, friends, that is the story of how the Bitterroot Valley Country Club wouldn't seat a 72-year-old widower in his father's frayed sport coat on the anniversary of his wedding. And how 5 days later, at 3 minutes past 5 on a Friday afternoon, the widower walked out of the upstairs boardroom with the deed of every acre, every wall, every brass bell, and every white-clothed table in the building folded into the inside pocket of that very same coat. The coat is still on the peg by the back door of the ranch house on Granger Lane. The mended elbow has held. The cuffs are still frayed. And every second Saturday in October, until he's no longer able, Hollis Granger drives up the East Side Highway, walks up the limestone steps, and sits at the table by the river bend window across from a place set for two. And that, friends, that is the story.